Got him. Come up with some slides before the beard came off. That was a little earlier. But I'm glad to be back. It's always fun to get outside of Washington. In Washington these days, it's a very incestuous place. I mean, all that really matters there is what happens this year. That is, Washington revolves around power. So the question is, who's going to be in charge in a year? That's really the issue. You know, January 20th, 2017, somebody new is going to be inaugurated. That will determine who the important lobbyists are. It's going to determine what interest groups are in charge. It will tell you who the committee chairmen are. So if you're somebody in Washington, you're going to the State of the Union speech tonight, and you're watching what happens in Iowa in a couple of weeks, and New Hampshire, and off it goes. So it's quite a time. And an awful lot has happened over the last year, a lot on issues. You know, we're involved in kind of multiple wars. There's kind of religious persecution going on. There's terrorism. We've got this rather crazy presidential election going on that, you know, it really, it's quite an extraordinary time. In fact, I can't think of a presidential race like this one in my lifetime, and even I think in Mr. Miller's lifetime, which is a little longer than mine, and one that is as quirky and strange and weird as this one. I mean, we've often had kind of oddball candidates showing up, but never have I seen one where the candidate who makes the most outrageous statements constantly keeps going up. And basically everyone, in a kind of, from my standpoint as an outsider, it's rather fun to watch, where all of the kind of establishment prognosticators are wrong, constantly wrong. And they're incredibly frustrated. So Washington is this city where kind of people sit around, there's a conventional wisdom, everybody kind of knows everybody, and lo and behold, they don't know what to do. Because if there's one thing they don't like, it's somebody unpredictable who's not part of the group to be president, and they're all looking in horror at the thought that that just might happen. So I think it's going to be a very interesting race to watch. It has extraordinary consequences, obviously. You know, the presidential race in the United States is something that's watched around the world. If you talk to folks, no other country has quite the same thing. I mean, you know, Britain has an important election. You know it's between David Cameron and somebody else, but you don't actually vote for him. It's just not the same. In America, we have this 2-year process of electing the person commonly called the most powerful person on earth. I mean, we'll have extraordinary consequences what happens in November, and a lot of consequences on the issues that you know, that I'll be talking about. And I think what's critical, you realize we are, you know, America's at war again in the Middle East, and I think it helps explain a lot of the issues that we face. It helps explain why we face terrorism. It helps explain the expulsion of Christians from the Middle East and much of the political debate. What you see debated, how you see it debated, the statements being made. And I think it's important, if you look over time, say between 1945 and 1990, you know, the U.S. really didn't go to war that much in the Middle East. I mean, for the most part, we worried about the Soviets. We weren't kind of constantly going to war there. You know, in 1958, 1983, the U.S. was briefly involved in Lebanon, both times relatively briefly. The first time, more or less without bloodshed. The second time was a mess. You know, in the 1980s, we backed the actually Iraqis against Iran in a war, but we weren't involved militarily. We just supported them with intelligence and other stuff. You know, in the 1980s, we backed the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, but again, we were kind of in the background. And there are a lot of interventions. I mean, the U.S. has mucked around, say, in a place like Iran for many years, 1953, helping overthrow democratically elected prime minister. You know, these things matter over the long term. Nevertheless, if you're thinking about kind of actual combat, conflict, war, bombing, for the most part, we didn't do that. And there are still consequences. I mean, American intervention, if you look particularly, I think, looking back, why do we have problems with Iran? You really have to start not in, you know, back in, say, 1979 or something with the hostage crisis. You have to go back to 1953 and look at how things evolved in terms of change of government and how that all turned out. Nevertheless, you know, in terms of combat, we weren't that involved. But look since 1990. 1991, there's war in Iraq. The 1990s, later on, there's constant bombing and intervention in Iraq as part of this kind of process of trying to hold them back and sanctions on them. 2001, the Afghanistan war starts. We get involved, and lo and behold, it's still going on. We're still seeing them dying there. 2003 is the Iraq invasion. 2011, we get involved in Libya. The 2014, it's Syria, and it's Iraq again. And we have, you know, active drone campaigns in Yemen and Pakistan. And at the moment, all of those are going on at once. So while we don't have a huge war in the sense of World War II or even, say, a Korean War, you know, the U.S. is involved militarily in Lebanon, in all these places. It's involved Libya, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, all these places. And now it's a lot worse than it was before. When you start thinking about problems of military conflict, you think about problems of kind of authoritarian regimes, you think of problems of war. I mean, all of these things come out of that kind of persistent conflict. That in your lifetime, it's hard to think, when was America actually at peace? That even during the Cold War, it was kind of ugly with the Soviets. Everybody's very nervous about things blowing up. But we had a couple of big wars and then more or less peace. But you look over the last 15, 20 years, constant conflict. And I think that it's important, when you look at terrorism, to realize, why does terrorism occur? We want to look at it as being, well, it's because we're so wonderful, obviously. That's why people are attacking us. And I think the challenge here is terrorism cannot be justified. It's evil. It's nasty. It's an attack on non-combatants. But it's important to understand it. It's important to take a very tough look. If it was simply that, the terrorists don't like liberal societies, the question is, why isn't there terrorism in Sweden, Switzerland, Denmark, Portugal, Greece, Norway? I mean, these are not countries which find themselves with massive amounts of terrorism. Norway had a homegrown incident, some crazy kind of nationalist guy mad about immigration stuff, killed a lot of people. But if you're thinking about the kind of terrorism we worry about, for the most part, those countries don't have it. At the same time, countries that have a lot of terrorism problems, Russia. Now, this is not a place we typically think of as being, isn't that a wonderful liberal society? First Amendment, protecting individual liberties, great liberal place. Sri Lanka, they had a long-running guerrilla war with terrorism as a major part of that. India, problems with terrorism. I mean, these are not societies we initially look at and think, isn't obviously somebody's attacking them because they are so liberal and wonderful. The point is, terrorism is actually a political issue. And I think there are a couple of different kinds of terrorism one has to look at. The first one, I think, you look back to the Paris attack, not the most recent one, but the Charlie Hebdo one, the one at the magazine. It strikes me what you find there is homegrown, and it really was an attack on what individuals were doing. They were seen as an attack on a religious faith. And I think to some degree we've had that in Philadelphia. You may not have read about. There was a recent incident. Some guy showed, there was a cop just sitting in his car on the street, and some guy comes up and starts shooting at him. And shot 11 times. Luckily, the cop was only hit 3 times, so he'll probably be okay doing his arm damage. And he told the police the reason he did that is because the police were enforcing, bad laws according to Allah. So I mean, what you're seeing there is not so much politics and big issues, but he's kind of mad about this kind of society, what it does in terms of his religious values. And I think this could become an increasingly big problem, especially in Europe, where you have a large population of immigrants who aren't really assimilated as well, and where you get the rise of radicalism, small numbers. I mean, the point is, it's not like everyone there is, but it's where you have communities where within that there are these kind of pockets. And what you're seeing in many ways, I think, it's exacerbated by unemployment, it's exacerbated by senses of isolation. There's a lot of things that play into that. And I would argue what you're seeing with this kind of terrorism, is it mimics what you see within many, especially Muslim-majority societies, which is treatment of religious minorities. And it's not just Muslim societies, though, it's heavily that. If you look at, for example, India with Hindu nationalism, even Buddhism, you have very nationalist versions of Buddhism in Sri Lanka and Burma. I mean, you may have read, if you pay attention to Burma, there's a Muslim minority called Rohingyas who have been persecuted, tens of thousands of people pushed out of their homes. And there is a very nationalistic Buddhist movement that's doing that. And what you're finding in those societies where you see blasphemy laws, laws against apostasy, laws against religious conversion, that it's very much a sense of, you can argue that that's a domestic form of terrorism, whatever you want to call it. That what you're doing is you're using, religious faith is driving it. It's driving it based upon individual behavior. And what we find with the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and I think in certain ways this guy in Philadelphia, is that sense of, even in another society, I want to apply those values. And I'll use violence to apply those values. I think the good news is those have not been huge attacks so far. But it's something that it's hard to deal with, especially if it's homegrown. I think that's a form of terrorism that's out there. I think the biggest form of terrorism, especially that the U.S. has dealt with, is much more the political. It's 9/11. It's the latest attacks in Paris. Indeed, that attack was not the only one that occurred around that time. A Russian jet was down going from Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt back to Russia by ISIS. The day before the Paris attacks, there were 2 bombs set off in a Shiite, a Hezbollah neighborhood in Beirut. and Hezbollah has been involved fighting against ISIS and Islamic State in Syria. I mean, this was clearly an attack. It was a terrorist attack on a religious people based on a political target. Then there was the Paris one. And you see this in a lot of different places. The Khobar Towers were attacked a number of years ago, American military installation in Saudi Arabia. I mean, there are a lot of these things you can kind of look at, and what you find is they're essentially political or military retribution. And I think what's important with them is it's not justified, but you've got to understand what's motivating. It's not being motivated because, oh, we have a First Amendment. It's being motivated because essentially it's part of a larger conflict, and this is the weapon they have. There's been a lot of research. A professor out of Ohio, Pape, and some others have looked at instances of terrorism over the years. Lots of different countries have faced terrorism. And it's almost always in response to occupation and political and military conflict. That the good news is, there are a lot of folks out there, if you're at war with, they don't have carrier groups. They don't have missiles. They don't have armored divisions, so they can't fight that way. The one way they can fight is to attack non-combatants. And it becomes their weapon of choice. Until Iraq, the most active suicide bombers on earth were in the country of Sri Lanka. And my guess is that's a country that most of you haven't thought a lot about. It's basically off the coast of India. It had kind of majority-minority. The Tamils were in revolt against the Sinhalese. Bitter civil war got settled a few years ago. The Sinhalese won. And the Tamils used suicide terrorism. A lot of young people, a lot of teenagers in that. So it was a military tactic. The weaker side said, how can we do this? They went after, almost killed the president of the country and others as part of that. Russia has had attacks on schools, attacks on subways, a lot of times led by widows of men killed in Chechnya. That basically, again, this is part of a tactic, a political tactic of revenge against the state involved in a war. Lebanon, 1983. I worked for Ronald Reagan. I have extraordinary respect for him. But he put the U.S. military in the middle of a civil war. I mean, extraordinary conflict, 100,000 people dead. If you go to Beirut today, you will still see buildings that have been damaged from the Civil War. The war ended back in 1990. He put American forces in the middle. They actually took sides. U.S. naval vessels sat offshore bombarding, some of the contending parties. Can't surprise you that they attack and bring to a barracks. And what you see with this, and I mentioned, I think, especially you think about ISIS, Islamic State, 3 attacks in a row. Russian jet, Hezbollah neighborhood, Paris, all of those tied to the ongoing conflict in Syria because all 3 of those parties were involved in that war. The U.S. has been relatively successful in stopping more of those attacks after 9/11. I mean, among our advantages in the United States is big oceans, a long ways away, harder to get here, different culture, I mean, all of that. A much more assimilated immigrant populations. We don't have a lot of the same problems. Europe is much more vulnerable. And I think we see that with the Paris attack. Much harder to insulate Paris, much harder to insulate Brussels and other countries, when you're facing that. And the harder is like San Bernardino. That one I think was pretty much a terrorist attack inspired by the Islamic State, but not run by it, not organized by it, not directed by it. So there the question is, what do you do when people in your own community gain inspiration and choose to go off and attack? Because it's much harder. You're trying to stop them from communicating overseas and people coming in. You can do that. But if it's a family, it's a husband and wife who decide they want to do this, it becomes much more difficult. And I think that this is the conflict we're dealing with today. I mean, there's Syria. I mean, the real map is incredibly messy because there are all these different factions. Who controls what? But the red area, I mean, these are the really evil folks. These are the ISIL, whatever you want to call them, ISIL, ISIS, Islamic State. That folks who are, it's a really ruthless bunch of characters, bad folks. And the question is, what do you do about them? Now, I think what's interesting here, when you think about America's role, I think it's fair to ask, why is America involved? Because in fact, they are the enemies of essentially everyone in the region. I mean, they're enemies of Turkey to the north. They're enemies of Syria, which you see marked, Iraq. Further east is Iran. They're enemies of that. Jordan is down south of Syria. They don't mark it there, but it's a little bit. They're enemies of that. They burned the Jordanian pilot alive. They're enemies of Saudi Arabia, which is most of the territory down here to the further south. if you look at the countries in the region, Islamic State hates all of them. Now, all of them collectively have about 1 million men under arms. Turkey itself alone has about 400,000 men in the army. So you would think that if they wanted to deal with the problem, they could deal with 20 or 30,000 people in the red zone. The problem is, why should they do that if America will do it for them? That we've made it very easy. I mean, Saudi Arabia started out as part of this coalition. Saudi Arabia hasn't bombed them for 6 months. You know, all of our kind of coalition allies in the Arab world have all kind of wandered off doing other things. I think it's important when you're thinking about why does it exists. You know, it's been thrown around a lot in the presidential campaign. And this is one of those things I get a little frustrated. I'm not a great fan of President Obama, but I'm an even less fan of people who blame him for everything. I just don't, it doesn't matter what the problem is. You listen to the GOP debate and everybody hates him and everything's his problem. And if you want to blame somebody for ISIS, you blame George W. Bush. Bush invaded Iraq, wrecked the place, destroyed it. And that is where ISIS came from. The Al-Qaeda in Iraq turned into ISIS. It would not exist but for the invasion of Iraq. And the problem is that, number one, the occupation was botched. And number two, President Bush put in power a sectarian by the name of Maliki, in which you essentially had a sectarian conflict. The reason they've got a kind of the red zone within Iraq is because there are a lot of Sunnis there and former Baathists who were kind of, Saddam Hussein was a Sunni. They all decided it was better to hang out with the guys from the 7th century than to live with the people running Baghdad. So it's not as if the ISIS itself was so strong. It turns out a lot of their military are the guys from the 21st century who hate the guys in Baghdad more than they hate the guys in the 7th century. So, I mean, this stuff goes back a long time. It's not as if this is all, I think that President Obama's foreign policy lacks a certain, shall we say, competence. Nevertheless, I think one wants to be very careful trying to dump everything on him. Political parties have that. Everybody wants to blame everybody else. These are extraordinarily complex problems. So when you start thinking about who's to blame and what the answer is, there are no easy answers. And you don't, just try to dump it all in one party or the other, you're probably not going to do very well. And the question is, why shouldn't these other countries deal with it? The problem is everybody has their own agenda. America has a very complicated agenda. Everybody else has a relatively easy agenda. Turkey is mostly concerned about getting rid of Assad, who's president of Syria. They also worry about the Kurds. The Kurds are the largest people group on earth who don't have a country. They're spread throughout Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. And so basically, Turkey doesn't care much about ISIS. They care about these other things. Saudi Arabia doesn't care about ISIS. I joke that actually Saudi Arabia is kind of a housebroken version of ISIS. They execute people. They do all sorts of atrocious things. But we like them because they sell oil to us. But basically, all they care about is getting rid of Assad. They don't care about ISIS. The Iraqis don't like ISIS because it's taken apart their country, so they're focused on that. Iran doesn't like ISIS because Iran is Shia, ISIS is Sunni, and get into this whole conflict. The Russians are involved. All they care about is saving Assad. Everybody has one thing they really care about. America wants to do it all. We want to get rid of ISIS. We'd like to get rid of Assad, but not too quickly because it'll mess up getting rid of ISIS. We like the Kurds, but we can't really give them a state because then the Turks will be mad at us. We're trying to get Sunni Jordan, Sunni Saudi Arabia to work with Shia Iraq and Shia Iran. Oh boy, isn't that a lot of fun. We're trying to get the Turks to get involved even though they hate the Kurds more than they hate, this is the American policy, trying to make all this stuff work. And I think that's the challenge for us is, if your foreign policy isn't terribly gifted, how do you make that work? We haven't done it very well. I think we made a mistake jumping in. I think what we need to do basically say is that this really is a regional issue. You guys are the ones most at risk. If the ISIL or Islamic State had its way, the royals in Riyadh would be hanging from lampposts. They'd like to overthrow all this stuff. All these countries really should be involved. And I think that if you look at the deal, the terrible atrocity recently in Paris, I found frustrating. President Hollande came on and said, "My goodness, we were at war." And that was November, and my reaction was, "Well, yeah, you've been at war for 14 months." What people weren't reporting was the fact that France had been bombing the red zone since September 2014, which means from the standpoint of the Islamic State, they've been at war for 14 months. Now, Islamic State, I'm happy to have bombed them. They're evil people. But it's rather strange to come forward and be shocked where after 14 months of bombing the other folks, you get attacked and suddenly you're shocked. The good news is the Islamic State doesn't have airplanes. If they had airplanes, they could have bombed Paris, right? But they didn't. And indeed, that's what nation states typically do. Every war the United States has been in since World War II, we bombed the capital of the country we were dealing with. You know, we bombed Rome, we bombed Tokyo, we bombed Berlin, we bombed Pyongyang in the Korean War, we bombed Hanoi in the Vietnam War, we bombed Baghdad and we fought Iraq. We bombed them all for military reasons. So, and actually the French have bombed Raqqa, which is kind of the nominal capital there. So the problem there is that what the Islamic State did in Paris was, I think, basically retaliation, as shooting down a Russian plane, because Russia had been bombing them, as taking out a Shia neighborhood in Beirut. That essentially, if you go to war, you got to know the cost. You got to be prepared for it. So the point is not that you never go to war. It's not that you never act, but don't be surprised. We know that their only weapon they really have is that, and that's what they're going to use. The question of what to do, it strikes me that there are a couple of different things. One of which is, people who want to kill you, you have to kill and incapacitate. There are a lot of people out there who hate Americans, British, French, other folks. They're not going to drop that. You have to deal with it. But you want to use the right tools. I mean, you want to defund these groups. How do you stop money? One of the problems is that we think Islamic State sells oil through Turkey. The charges are actually the son of the president of Turkey is involved. Hard to prove this stuff. But you want to cut off their money. You want better intelligence sharing. You want to use targeted military tools like special forces and drones. Generally, you don't want to start new wars. I mean, the war in Iraq created a lot of terrorism. That's not helpful. The other thing you want to do is make fewer enemies. You want to be careful what you do. You want to count the cost. You want to realize every time you make a mistake and kill innocent people, somebody's going to be mad at you. Every time you jump into somebody else's war. And I go back to Lebanon. If you put your forces in the middle of somebody else's civil war, don't be surprised when you become a target. And it's the same thing, I think, that's really happening in Syria today. The other thing is, I think, from the standpoint of Americans, is not to be afraid of the world. That despite all this stuff going on, for the most part, most of the places you go, you're going to be relatively safe. And to me, the best ambassadors for America are Americans. It's you all. It's people who go abroad and do good things, help people in need, make friends, engage. In July, I was in a refugee camp in Lebanon, or in Jordan, in the south, about 80,000 people, just south of the Syrian border. A lot of different NGOs active there. I went with a group called the International Orthodox Christian Charities. It's the Orthodox Church. It has its own set of charities. That's the sort of thing we need to do. Americans need to be engaged in the world. And we also need to welcome people here. I know a number of students here from around the world. To me, that's one of the best things America can do, is welcome people, bring people, show them what I think is the goodness of America. That's something that's very important. Over the long term, I think critical for our country and our country's role in the world. So ultimately, hugely complicated issues. No easy answers. No politician out there, I think, has an easy answer. They all tell you they know what to do, carpet bombing or something, and good luck. That ain't going to solve the problem. I mean, a lot of different pieces to this. And I hope that all of you will be involved. I hope that looking ahead, America is your country. You're going to be bequeathed a pretty messy inheritance when Mr. Miller and I kind of go tottering off and leave these issues. You all are going to be stuck with the results. So I hope you all will be involved. It's going to be your America. You're going to be paying the price. The wars that are going to be fought will be your wars. The conflicts will be your conflicts. The insecurities will be your insecurities. So I encourage all of you to be involved. That you don't leave the decisions to others. I live in Washington, or just south of it. People in Washington are happy not to have the input of other people. They're happy to make the decisions themselves. You can't afford to let them do that. So I'll close with that. I encourage you to be active. And like Mr. Miller said, I'm happy to take questions on anything you want.
What would you consider to do with the Syrian refugee crisis going on, if you take into consideration that for the Boston bombing, the two men responsible were refugees, and that it was confirmed that ISIS is faking passports for their affiliates so that they qualify for immigration?
Well, the number, I mean, if you look at it, I think, it's like, I think their parents were political. I mean, they weren't technically refugees. I mean, I think that if you look at the numbers that have come in, you know, the risk of terrorism from somebody coming in like that is a lot less, frankly, than the risk of terrorism from kind of the homegrown people you have. But I think you have to take it into account. So, I mean, and the challenge here, we've never really had kind of the refugee flow out of a war zone where there are a lot of people who might wish you ill. So it's a very different, you know, we've taken a lot of Vietnamese, America's taken a lot of, you know, other groups, you know, I mean, Cubans, Haitians, and others have come. So it's hard because, you know, how do you vet, you know, refugees from Syria? I do think that, I mean, a compassionate response is to take some and try to be careful. I mean, at the very least, I mean, the easiest would be, I mean, at some level, Sunni refugees, you know, tend to be the folks fleeing from Syria, you know, all the countries around, a lot of them are Sunni, could conceivably put them up. I mean, the problem is none of the surrounding, you know, Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey have more than 1 million refugees each. The Gulf states of Saudi Arabia, none. None. Well, it strikes me, you know, that arguably is the first place that at least Sunnis should go. I do think the question of what do you do about Christians, Yazidis, you know, religious minorities, they will not be comfortable in any of these other countries. I mean, Saudi Arabia is a totalitarian state. There's not one church, synagogue, or temple that operates. So I do think at the very least we could consider bringing in religious minorities, saying there's a unique case there. The other thing is, as much as I think we might want to bring in refugees, if a community doesn't want them, you don't want to be in a position where you're trying to force, I mean, to me, that's the worst thing for both the community and the refugees. You want this to be kind of a happy circumstance. I have a friend in an NGO that's brought, of all things, Burmese refugees, ethnic Karen, to Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, which is on the border with Canada. This is a place that's cold in August. You know, so these Burmese refugees show up from a place where you always dress in shorts and flip-flops, and they show up in winter in shorts and flip-flops in Sault Ste. Marie. But I mean, the community loved them. They become citizens, they were hard workers. I mean, you know, the news stories will appear, they've taken the oath of, you know, nationality and whatever. So there's a lot of benefit that comes from that, but you don't want to force people in. So that's a hard one. So I think America's heritage is to accept, but the security issues are real.
How do you, kind of tangentially related to that question, the state governors that are refusing to allow their states to accept refugees despite the fact that the federal government says they will, how do you respond to that? Because like the governor of this state, Chris Christie, refused repeatedly to accept refugees from New Jersey.
He actually can't refuse to accept them. What he can do is refuse to allow state agencies to assist. I mean, the governor has no authority to stop. I mean, immigration is a federal issue. I mean, unless he calls out the state militia and try, you know, that's not going to happen. It's a question of refusing to cooperate. And it's very, you know, for the most part, because of federalism, the federal government cannot force a state to cooperate. But they can still send the refugees. But again, going back to this, you do want to be careful. I mean, again, you want these people to be accepted. You don't want to kind of, you will take them no matter. I mean, I think that's a real challenge. How do you find the places that in fact are receptive and you know, for both the community and them, you make things potentially worse. But I think it's a lot of these governments, they're playing politics. Look, you're running for president, this is grandstanding, I think.
Well, what do you make of ISIS's use of social media and how we should, is there any kind of...
Well, I'd like us to be better at social media. I mean, I'm happy to have Twitter suspend ISIS Twitter accounts when they can. I mean, I think that's, but again, it's hard. The problem is how do you get the U.S. government involved in stuff like that? I tend to think that, you know, expecting kind of federal bureaucrats to, you know, people like me to sort out social, look, I'm not, I mean, I'm on Twitter, but I have no doubt that you all are far ahead of me. So the question of how you deal with that, again, a lot of it, I think you're probably better dealing with Silicon Valley, you're dealing with, you know, Twitter executives, kind of, if you know, how do you try to shut down murderers? I mean, I think it's a good question. It's not that the government's the best place to do that, but you know, it's again, you want to end recruiting if you can. You want to make them less glamorous. You want to find ways, you know, to try to work against them in what they seem to think is their strength.
My question is, how do you think America should interact with these countries like Turkey and Syria and Iraq if they all have their own priorities? Like, for example, you said, well, I'm from Turkey and I know that like a lot of people are refusing the Kurds and they don't care about ISIS, they're worried about their own country. So how do you think America can help with that?
Well, this is the problem of international relations. I mean, there is, I mean, the U.S., I think, has a problem in the sense that it's so used to the last 20, 30 years of being the unipower, the dominant country. It kind of expects everybody to do what it wants. And other countries aren't interested. I mean, President Erdogan in Turkey has his own agenda. So he's going to do what he wants. So I mean, the U.S. has, and I mean, I argue this, I do a lot of work on Korea and China. Now, the U.S. wants China basically to solve its problem with North Korea. You know, can you please stop the crazy North Koreans from shooting off nuclear weapons or something? You know, and the Chinese, I mean, have a complicated response. So basically, it's not our fault, it's your fault. You know, and you can't expect us to blow up the place and have a million refugees, you know, flowing over the Yalu. And the U.S. government just kind of tells them what to do. I keep writing things saying, you know, you've got to convince them, which is you've got to speak to their interest, which is they really don't want to blow up a place and have military conflict on the peninsula and a million refugees across the Yalu. I mean, loose nuclear weapons, I mean, I can spin this out. I think the U.S. has to be better at diplomacy. And what we have to realize is we can't order them around. You know, the Secretary of State shows up and we have a 60-member coalition. Well, even at the best, we were responsible, that is the U.S., and I say we, for 85 or 90% of the airstrikes. I mean, it wasn't an international coalition, it was us and a few people doing a couple things to make us happy. So I think the U.S. has to be more realistic. And, you know, to me, the best way to deal with Turkey is to say, we're not going to solve the problem, right? If ISIS shows up in your country, they just had a terrorist bombing today in Istanbul, that, you know, I mean, it could be Kurdish, because there's a lot going on there, or it could, that I haven't heard of, they trying to figure out, is it ISIS or...
It's supposedly ISIS suicide bomb.
So, I mean, that tells me that, well, you got a big problem. Istanbul is it's a beautiful city, the major biggest city in the country. I mean, that is clearly an attack upon the country. I mean, that would seem to be signal to the Erdogan government that, hey guys, this really should be your priority. So I think the U.S. has to step back some and let consequences direct countries. And the U.S. isn't going to get everything it wants. And Turkey's a good example. Very nationalistic, very proud. It's not a country you can push around and say, here, you know, go do this for us.
How do you see Europe reacting to this in the future? Do you see like the closing of the Schengen zone? Do you see any sort of, I mean, for the past, couple decades, it's been a pretty open movement. Do you see that changing?
Yeah, it's a mess. I mean, this is a place that, you have all these right-wing parties. I mean, just like in Germany, the whole idea was the Christian Social Union, based in Bavaria, would always be the most right-wing party. You didn't want more right-wing parties. Now you have the alternative for Germany, which has made immigration a big issue. It's getting into state parliaments. Merkel is under trial. I mean, she's been under fire anyway. They've just had these violent attacks where they've had immigrants attacking women, and then they've had vigilante nationalists attacking immigrants. I mean, so even in a place like Germany, which has been very solid and whatnot, you're seeing these problems. You see Marine Le Pen in France. You see the kind of a relatively authoritarian government in Hungary that's picked up on this issue. There are huge problems there. I mean, it's kind of fomenting nationalism. It's having an impact on the election system. They had this agreement to share refugees. It's not working. They tell refugees they're going to Luxembourg. They had a story on this, like in the Post. And the refugee said, I wanted to go to like France, or I want to go to Britain. What's this Luxembourg thing? Countries don't want to accept them. And the Schengen zone, it's the wonderful part of it. I mean, you visit Europe, you show up port of entry, and you go anywhere you want. It's great. But I think that probably is going to die. And part of that may get tied into the whole question of British renegotiation. Part of it's migrants, part of it's welfare benefits. I think Europe's in extraordinary flux. And I'm nervous about the rise of these nationalistic, I don't think they're fascist yet. But these are the kinds of issues that populists and kind of nasty folks tend to use, and we're seeing that active in a lot of different countries. The variants of that, you see it in Finland, you see it in the Netherlands, you see it in France, you see it in Hungary. I mean, to some degree, UKIP in Britain, again, they're not fascist, but some of these themes that are kind of ugly are really starting to percolate through politics. So I think Europe's in a lot of flux. And I don't know what to predict where it's going to end up. I think nobody knows at this stage.
What do you think of the impact of refugees on economically stable developed countries?
Well, in general, I think immigration is an economic positive. Now, the challenge you get is if you bring over a lot of folks who aren't well kind of prepared to work. So, a lot of these people are professional. On the other hand, if you're bringing over people who don't know the language and don't have the skills, well, you can be in a tough spot, because in fact, you're going to have to subsidize them for a long time. I mean, I think if you bring refugees over, you bring them over not for economic purposes, you bring them over for humanitarian purposes, and you decide to bear the cost. So I would separate the refugee issue from the immigration issue. I mean, there's a whole set of issues with immigration that are complicated and difficult. And I'd say refugees, it's kind of like political asylum. You grant political asylum to people because they're trying to escape tyranny. You don't do it because whether or not you think they'd be a positive economic benefit. You know, a good society lets people come over who are fleeing tyranny. So I would treat refugees in the same context, that they'll probably cost us money, right? Over the long term, you know, they get out and work and other stuff, all that money may come back in economic kind of what they're generating, but I wouldn't let that be the deciding factor, you know, in terms of bringing it in.
What do you think of Bernie Sanders?
Oh, I think Bernie's a hoot. I mean, I mean, he is this kind of American socialist. I mean, I love, you know, he uses the term socialist, but he doesn't, you know, as far as I'm aware, he doesn't want to nationalize anything. You know, the old socialism meant owning the means of production. His socialism is kind of welfare and redistribution kind of stuff. Look, I'm a libertarian, I'm not a lefty, but I appreciate people who make fundamental critiques. I get very tired of kind of the muddled center that's just kind of a blob, you know, and nothing ever really changes. You know, things aren't working, but we can't really do anything about it, and you just kind of stumble along. And look, he's causing poor Hillary Clinton a lot of trouble. The latest polls show him ahead in both Iowa and New Hampshire. You know, this is not good. If you're supposed to be the inevitable candidate, you better not lose the first two races. It kind of, you know, causes a problem for your message. So I'm enjoying him. Just as, I mean, in many ways I enjoy Trump. I think he's a bit more problematic in terms of what he might do and where he's at. Nevertheless, I do get a certain amount of satisfaction at, you know, again, there's this received wisdom. I mean, Jeb Bush, I think, is a perfectly nice guy. But of course, he's going to run, and the expectation is he raises $100 million in the super PACs. He's got the name, he's got the connection, he's Mr. Moderate, and he's going to win. And lo and behold, he spends $50 million in the super PACs, and his poll ratings go from, I don't know, 15 to 3%. You know, I kind of like that. It's like, oops, well, you know, there went that, you know, assumption about what was going to happen. So Sanders is kind of the same thing. This is what, 73-year-old, whatever he is, running for president against, you know, the inevitable candidate with the machine behind her, and Bill and all this stuff, and oh my, he can beat her. Wow. So I think that's kind of fun.
What do you think about the Federal Reserve changing the reserve rates basically just bring the rates up?
Well, look, as somebody who saves money, I'd like to actually earn some interest on my money. You know, everybody always thinks wonderful rates are really low. Well, yeah, unless you're saving money. What do I do with my money? I have a savings account that's useless, basically. I mean, you know, there's a place to park a little money and figure, well, at least there's, you know, insurance, so if the bank goes under, I still have the money, as opposed to keeping it under my mattress. But for the most part, I could pretty much keep it under my mattress at the same interest rate. And I also think, you know, I think there's a huge problem where you're trying to pump the economy up year after year by essentially, you're so desperate to get people to borrow and spend, you have to essentially say it's free. I mean, well, that does suggest that, well, I mean, should you really be investing at that point? Is if you invest at that, what return do you expect? And over time, it just strikes, you know, there's a lack of realism. The danger is another bubble. I mean, you know, real estate, that's what China's going through to some degree now. I mean, you look at, like, some of the real estate. I mean, they've had huge real estate bubble in certain places, in the stock market, you know, and whatnot. You know, and that's what the U.S. went through in 2008. You know, you look at housing prices and stuff. You don't want to go through that again. So the problem for the Federal Reserve is how do you unwind this without causing chaos? You know, bonds drop in value when you raise interest rates. I mean, you know, I have a bond now, you know, it pays 1%, so the interest rates are going up, the bond is worth less because now the new bonds, you'll pay 2 or 3%. So if they do it radically and fast, all sorts of stuff happens. So they're just trying to do this, edge it up, edge it up, edge it up. They hope over time to unwind. And we'll see how they do. I mean, I wish them luck because it matters a lot for all of us.
Do you have any favorites in the presidential candidacy field based on foreign policy prowess and how that might narrow the GOP field based on that?
Well, look, my ideological preference would be Rand Paul. He hasn't run a particularly stellar campaign. And some of his positions have been rather less than libertarian in my view. But if I look across, I mean, he strikes me as being the one guy who's not completely insane when it comes to a lot of these issues. I mean, everybody else is bomb everybody. I mean, people like, you know, Christie, we love our allies, like the Saudi Arabian. I just kind of, they're totalitarians. You may tolerate them, you may deal with them, but kind of, I mean, if you're looking at Iran versus Saudi Arabia, and the question is human rights, there is no question which is better, which is Iran. I mean, in Iran, Christians actually worship. There are Jews in synagogues. There are temples. Now, some of these people get persecuted, but they exist. They have a presidential election that actually matters. Saudi Arabia? None of that. You know, I mean, this poor blogger, Raif Badawi, got 10 years plus 1,000 lashes, and then his human rights lawyer, who I think was like his former brother-in-law, got 15 years, and they just arrested his sister, the ex-wife of the lawyer, because she's been running a Twitter account for her ex-husband. She got arrested like yesterday. These are monstrous people. I mean, in my view, basically, Saudi Arabia is kind of a housebroken view of Islamic State. You know, but we have Republican candidates who want to embrace them, and then Democrats do that too. So I think that the one guy who's at least come up with, you know, kind of, and the irony, and I did a Forbes column on it, was that of all the, I mean, setting aside Rand Paul, the other guy who's kind of interesting actually is Trump. He is not a doctrinaire anything. He goes out and says, I'm the most militaristic person in the race. It's completely false. He thought Iraq was a disaster. He's happy the Russians are bombing the Syrians. He doesn't understand why we should get rid of Assad. He wonders, why are we subsidizing the Europeans? Why don't they pay? So in fact, a lot of Trump's foreign policy positions are kind of idiosyncratic. I don't think he has an ideology that ties it together. But if, you know, if I can't have Rand Paul, at least on foreign policy, actually I'd probably choose Trump. Now there are other issues, and whether you actually want him in the Oval Office, that could be kind of interesting. I actually think he might be more rational there than, I mean, his business practice and people who work for him suggest that once the door closes, he's actually a rather nice guy to work for, which is an amazing concept. So, you know, a Trump presidency might be very different than what we imagine when we see him out at a rally. But the irony is on foreign policy, in my view, he's better than most of the others, who are basically almost all of them are full bore, bomb, you know, whatnot.